Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder how people with different personality structures think about themselves and their place in time? Today, we're diving into some fascinating new research that uses computers to understand the inner worlds of people with borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. So, imagine scientists trying to understand how people feel and experience their lives. Traditional psychology often struggles to capture the rich personal stories people tell. But what if we could use computers to analyze these stories in a systematic way? That is exactly what this study aims to do. They're looking at how people with borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder describe themselves and their sense of time compared to people without these diagnoses. The researchers call their approach computational phenomenology. Basically, they're using sophisticated computer programs to analyze language. They're particularly interested in what they call the supervised semantic differential, or SSD. Think of it as a tool that measures how people use words to describe big ideas like self and time. It looks at the words people use around these concepts in their personal stories. The big question here is whether people diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, BPD, or narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, talk about themselves and time in ways that are distinctly different from each other and from people who don't have these diagnoses. To figure this out, the researchers gathered life story interviews from 62 people. This included groups with BPD, NPD, and a group of healthy volunteers. These weren't just short answers. These were in-depth life story interviews, giving people a chance to share their experiences in their own words. The interviews were then turned into text, and the computer program got to work analyzing all those words. They used a special computer model trained on tons of polished text. This model understands how words relate to each other. Think of it like a giant dictionary where words are placed in a kind of map based on how they're used. The computer then looked at the words used around self and time in each person's interview. For each person, they created something called a personal concept vector, or PCV. Imagine a unique fingerprint for how that person talks about self or time. They did this by averaging out the meaning of the words used near those concepts in their interview, using a clever weighting system so that more important words counted more. This way, they got a readable representation of each person's unique way of talking about themselves and time. Now, the tricky part comparing these fingerprints across the different groups, they used a method called permutation inference. Basically, they shuffled the group labels many times to see if the differences they observed between the BPD, NPD, and control groups were likely due to chance or were real differences. They also looked at the centroids, which are like the average fingerprint for each group. Then they created contrast vectors to highlight the semantic differences between groups. This helped them see which words and ideas push the self or time vector in one direction versus another. And what did they find? It is pretty interesting. When it came to talking about the self, they found significant differences across all three groups. This means how people with BPD, NPD, and those without these diagnoses describe themselves is quite different. The computer could reliably tell the groups apart based on their self-descriptions. Let's break down what those self-concept differences look like. When they compared people with BPD to the control group, the BPD group's language around self was filled with intense emotional outbursts like crying, screaming, and shouting. They also talked about escape and forced movement, and even violence and suicidality. On the other hand, the control group used more conceptual language, talking about paradigms, methodologies, and framing things in terms of breadth, novelty, and functionality. They seemed more reflective and evaluative. Comparing BPD and NPD for self-concept, BPD again showed intense emotional outbursts, but their self-descriptions were also heavily tied to interpersonal relationships, talking about mothers, fathers, boyfriends, and friends. The NPD group, however, used more mechanistic language to describe themselves, focusing on goals, strategies, and systems. They talked about flexibility, diversity, and stability and long-term functioning. It's like they described themselves in terms of how they operate. When comparing NPD to the control group for self-concept, it got even more nuanced. The NPD group's language involved violence and coercion, and a lot of low-arousal negative affect like fatigue, frustration, and apathy. The control group, for comparison, used everyday evaluative language and conversational markers, sounding more grounded and oriented towards social interaction. So for self, BPD seems to be characterized by intense emotions and relationships, while NPD, in contrast to BPD, is more internally focused, talking about self-regulation and stability. But compared to controls, NPD shows more signs of negative affect and a sense of helplessness. Now, let's shift to the concept of time. This is where the findings get particularly striking. Remember how the self-concept showed differences across all groups. Well, time was different. The analysis revealed that differences in how people talked about time were driven primarily by the BPD group. The NPD group and the control group were not reliably separable when it came to their descriptions of time. When comparing BPD and controls on time, the BPD group used language that was very concrete and event-anchored. They talked about specific calendar units like weeks and months, numerical durations, and often linked these to crisis episodes like hospitalizations or suicide attempts. It sounds like time for them is marked by these significant, often difficult events. The control group, on the other hand, used more conceptual language about time, discussing its meaning, definition, and metaphorical framing, and focusing on what is pragmatically important now. In the BPD versus NPD comparison for time, the BPD side again showed this concrete crisis-linked temporal scaffolding. They used specific dates, weekdays, and counted durations. The NPD side, however, framed time more through conceptual interpretation and meaning-making, using words like reality, perception, and talking about the future as uncertain or short. They also seem to focus more on pragmatic realism and connecting present circumstances to future expectations. This is a really key finding. It suggests that people with BPD experience and talk about time in a very structured way, often tied to specific events and durations. Especially crises non-BPD individuals, both NPD and controls, seem to use more abstract and reflective language when discussing time. So, what does all of this mean? The researchers found that language-based analysis can indeed pinpoint differences in how people with BPD and NPD experience themselves and time. The robust separation in self-descriptions across all groups suggests that narrative identity formation is a key area of variation across these diagnoses. For BPD, the findings strongly support existing ideas that their sense of self is fragmented and highly influenced by intense emotional and interpersonal experiences. The way they talk about time, marked by specific dates and durations, acts as a kind of scaffolding to make these intense events narratable, but it doesn't necessarily create a coherent life story. It is like using milestones to map out a difficult journey. For NPD, the picture is more complex. Their self-descriptions are more detached and focused on internal mechanisms and regulation. While they might not have the overt fragmentation seen in BPD, they do show significant negative affect and even crisis-linked language when compared to controls. The research hints that their struggle might be less about a fractured self and more about a dysregulated internal world. It's important to acknowledge the study's limitations. The groups were relatively small, and the computer models used, while advanced, are still simplifications of human language and experience. Also, this method, by focusing on group averages, might miss some of the unique within-group differences. Future research could explore these individual differences more deeply, perhaps by looking at how severe symptoms relate to specific language patterns or how these linguistic features predict real-world outcomes. They also suggest that the contrast between NPD and controls in time perception, while not statistically significant, hints at a difference in how they phrase their abstract thinking, with NPD possibly using more existential or metaphysical language. This study is a great example of how computational methods can help us understand complex psychological phenomena. By analyzing the language people use, we can gain new insights into their lived experiences. It shows us that the way we talk about ourselves and our lives, especially our sense of time, can reveal a lot about our inner worlds. It is amazing how technology is opening up new avenues for understanding the human mind. If you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more fascinating dives into the world of psychology. Until next time, stay curious.